Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and it is time for another Shelf of Many Things, where I take a look at indie and small press tabletop role-playing games and RPG accessories. This time I'm delving back into the world of Dark Wizard Games' Maximum Mayhem Dungeons for a bit of a 3-4. I'll be taking a look at 3 entries in the Maximum Mayhem Dungeon series. Number 5, Palace of the Dragon's Princess. Number 6, Moving Maze of the Mad Master. And number 7, Dread Swamp of the Banshee, which the author was kind enough to send me review copies of. Indeed, I'll be touching a bit on the box set that they are available in as well. Maximum Mayhem Dungeons are old school in both style and system, primarily designed for first edition compatible OSR systems such as Osric, but generally compatible with many other OSR offerings. I've already reviewed a number of entries in this series, and I have thus far been pleased with the production value and found them to be slightly over the top, high adventure modules with an old school feel and a mix of interesting action scenes and humor. Now, despite my generally very positive take on the series so far, I did have some criticisms of those modules I've covered so far, especially with regard to the technical execution of the writing within rather than the stories and the adventure designs themselves, so I encourage you to take a look at those videos if you're interested in this adventure series all in all. And I say that because I need note something before getting into the modules themselves, and that is the form factor of the adventures. Aside from the usual PDF through DriveThruRPG, all 3 are also available as softcover physical copies in classic detached cover style, similar to the old modules. Further, if you're interested in the series, there is a limited availability box set called the World of Mayhem available from Dark Wizard Games' site. At least at the time of this recording there is. This box set comes with a nice, sturdy box to contain the modules, a set of dice, a set of Chessex dice were sent for me. Not sure if that's going to be in all of them, but they're nice enough, all in all. Decent quality from what I've seen. Certainly very attractive color, at least. Then they also come with a dice bag to store them in, with the Dark Wizard Games logo on it. There are also copies of Maximum Mayhem Dungeons, modules 1 to 5, a few of which I've actually taken a look at already. And it also comes with Monsters of Mayhem number 1, which is a collection of monsters from the various modules in here. So if you want to use them for your own adventures, that is an option. They are, as always, designed for Osric, but they are compatible with basically every similar OSR system. All in all, and you'll see 2 copies of the Palace of the Dragon's Princess in there, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But all in all, I'm rather pleased with the box set that was sent to me, although I must admit that I'm not so sure I would have bought it on my own accord. For one, I have a pretty bad track record of keeping box sets nice. In fact, you might even see scuffs and damage on this, even in the short time I've had before I took it to record for this review. I think it's of decent quality all in all, as are the print copies of the modules in question, so if you are one of the sorts that actually takes care of their products, then, it might be worthwhile. You'll just have to decide whether the family of adventures is up your alley first. And with all of that having been said, let's take a look at the 3 adventures in question themselves. I think I'll go ahead and cover their physical presentation as a group before delving into each adventure individually. All 3 of them are available as PDFs on DriveThruRPG, as I said before, as well as print products. For this review, I will also be using version 2 of the softcover physical copy of Palace of the Dragon's Princess, as it has apparently been revised and re-edited from an earlier version. And I'll touch on more of that in my comments later. So, first up is Palace of the Dragon's Princess. Physically, Palace of the Dragon's Princess is just shy of about 40 pages in a slipcover style with black and white interior. The cover, as always, is full color with a layout reminiscent of early edition TSR modules on both front and back, with the map printed in dark blue along the detachable interior cover, just if you like that old school style feel. There is the contents in a black and white format booklet, again similar to early edition TSR modules in terms of the looks and the feel, and you can pull it out for ease of reference at the table. The interior format is mostly two-column with black and white line art in line, either in line or as spreads, as you may have seen as I've been flipping through it, with each section heading nicely labeled in bold. Each encounter area has classic boxed read-aloud text, followed by a GM's descriptions of the contents of the room with monster stat blocks in bold and, easily referenced. Classic layout all in all, which will be very familiar to anyone who's run an old school module in the past. The other two modules follow much the same layout, although there are some variations based on their content. Most notably, Moving Maze of the Mad Master includes a separate cardstock version of the map itself with some separate wheels, as the titular moving maze is a fair part of the gameplay in the module. It also includes some small standees for some of the mechanical monstrosities you may encounter, and its own color fold-out map. Dread Swamp of the Banshee goes back to the simple detached cover version that you've seen in the other Maximum Mayhem offerings, although, it is a little bit of a larger book, clocking in at just shy of 50 pages. It's also a hex crawl, so the format moves from a key dungeon crawl and using the interior maps, although it does have minor dungeons in it, to a full-on hex area, description of the area, with, the format otherwise very similar. It's not that different, but it is worth noting. Anyway, as always, I will go over the contents in brief, then cover them in more detail, before giving my thoughts on the modules at the end. Now, this may include spoilers, at least for the overall story, but I won't necessarily go into every little book or every little encounter on the way, since I do like to leave a lot, open for people who purchase the module and want to play the module to find out during play. We will start with the Palace of the Dragon's Princess. It is geared towards a group of player characters from levels 8 to 12. In terms of content, there is, of course, the interior cover page with credits, an introduction that includes the GM's background, a summary of the history of the castle and the kingdom, and then the backstory that sets up the circumstances of the adventure. After this rather lengthy backstory, there is basic information regarding the castle's features, a rumor table to set seeds for the party's entry, as well as wandering monster information, adventure hooks, and then finally the adventure itself. The adventure itself is separated into encounter areas, and it occupies the vast majority of the book, as it should, after which there are alternate Ben Bar's Lived Gafe rules to deal with the particularly heavy portcullis in the castle, and I believe that's at the end. Yeah, way here at the end. And there is a list of the new monsters as well as their stats. A few pages of secondary maps are in here, as well as a few sample characters, before the book concludes with ads and legal material, as most do. In more detail, the introduction gives the background on the adventure, of course, which can be used either standalone or inserted into an ongoing campaign. You can clearly play this as part of an ongoing thing, since it is all self-contained. The GM background gives a recommended party layout. Then the summary briefly talks about the background that follows in the pages thereafter. Basically, that long ago, a dying king was overseeing the marriage of his daughter, Princess Francesca, to his knight, Sargon Valtorius. During the preparations for the ceremony, a great dragon called Malfesto flew in and took the castle over, killing partygoers and plunging the land into darkness. In the years since, the dragon's magic has spread through the land, and a cult devoted to his worship arose. And through it all, it is said that the princess still lives somewhere in the dragon's castle. After that, the story goes into more detail in following sections. There is a brief history of the kingdom, as well as a more in-depth point of view of the events leading up to the dragon's attack. First from the princess's view, then Sir Valtorius' view, and finally that of the dragon himself, Malfesto. These sections are rather extensive, verging on short story territory, and go well beyond what is usual for just the background of an adventure. They serve to point of showing that perhaps not is all as it seems, with the princess possibly under a spell, maybe not, and the knight not exactly having a sterling character himself, and so forth. Descriptions of the dragon cult that arose in the White Palace, where things take place, follow. As most of the adventure is set in the castle itself, the Castle Features section that follows gives basic details on the various parts of the castle, including the structure of various towers and fortifications. There is a rumors table that allows characters to start with information that may or may not be useful and may or may not be true. The Wandering Monsters section details 6 potential wandering encounters. These can be used either as random encounters if using a particular system's encounter check rules, or simply tossed at the characters whenever they may need a little extra motivation to move things on. But there is no just flat out, you have a 1 in 6 or whatever chance of encountering them right out of the box. The final part of the introduction section is a series of 5 adventure hooks to get the players involved, which range from the heroic to the scoundrelous, offering a wide variety of party alignments, to actually get into the adventure. In terms of the actual encounters within, as I mentioned, each one has a boxed read-aloud text followed by descriptions of what goes on in that area. These include encounters with stat blocks in bold and tactical information detailed where necessary, because a lot of these monsters will either one or have special sorts of things queued up. Generally, exploration proceeds from outside the castle, through the ruins of the castle above, and then into the dungeons beneath. However, there are a few different entrances to the castle grounds which allow the party to start exploration either above ground or below, provided they manage to wrestle their way in through the alternate methods. The upper levels of the castle are scarcely populated, and it is largely by various cult members, who mostly linger on the weak side compared to the party level. They don't start on guard so long as the party doesn't make a serious scene. They can actually probably cruise through this section pretty readily. More and more information about the various inhabitants of the castle can actually be acquired from the cultists, since they are actually quite talkative and will actually try to get the party to join their cult on several occasions, which they actually can do. If the party tries to come in from below, they encounter creatures called the Trakai Naga that dwell in the waterways under the castle. These are somewhat more hostile, at least initially, but may be dealt with more peaceably if handled correctly. Encounters within the castle range from an enchanted topiary plant garden to a greenhouse with a potential shambling mound. In fact, there's a fair amount of plant monsters on the grounds in general. Then there's the Ghost of the Old King, which offers more backgrounds on the details that led to the castle's fall, as well as a minor quest to give the characters. Due to the nature of the cult further within the castle, a few of the members were actually forced into the membership and may actually turn out to be unexpected allies. There is a rather interesting scene where the party, if they play their cards right, can be escorted to witness a cult ceremony and meet with Dragos, the leader of the cult himself. The way he's written comes off very much like a self-serving shyster and con man, and can be extremely entertaining to play, especially if one is familiar with the worst examples of certain less than scrupulous televangelists. A rather unpleasant encounter occurs with a creature that lives in the character's sewage system as well if the party pokes around too much. It is entirely possible for a character to be pulled through the backed up sewage system into the creature's lair below, and that can make for a rather unpleasant fate or something humorous depending on your particular group's brand of humor. The knight Sargon is also present within the castle, as is the princess, and while the knight himself has gone mad, a certain degree of leeway was given with the princess, who can be either played as a charmed pawn, an actual captive in the classic sense, or as a willing accomplice of the dragon as the GM decides is warranted. The module finishes with a grand showdown with the Dragon Malfesto, with all of the vast hoard of treasure that such a showdown entails. This is actually where the princess's variable motivations can make the fight play out rather differently depending on what you decide she, is there for. Now on towards the moving maze of the Mad Master. It is an adventure geared towards a slightly lower level range, levels 6 to 10. Again, there's an interior cover page with credits with Moving Maze of the Mad Master written by Alan Chamberlain. This is followed by the GM's background, a summary of the story behind the maze, then descriptions of the maze and its inhabitants. There's a section of special rules for the maze, since it is a unique sort of setting in and of itself, followed by variable traps that the party can encounter, a wandering monster table, ways to get the players into the maze, and a quick rumor table. The player's background follows that gives a nice way to get the party in on the right path, and then the bulk of the book is a keyed section that describes the important encounter areas, within the maze and its environs, as usual for these sorts of modules. The book does close with some stat blocks for a new and, in fact, a few old monsters. I can swear there's some in here that are actually, they should be. They're not in the SRD on a lot of things, so they included some of these monsters, like a giant gar, grimlock, that sort of thing, just in case your particular system of choice doesn't have them. There are a couple maps of areas that are beneath the maze, which the party can get to, and then a few pages of legal material. In more depth, the GM background of the moving maze mostly goes into the physical layout of the maze and its components, before the summary goes into the history of the Mad Master. Again, there's a bit of a short story telling the path of this sort of anti-wizard who built mechanisms of more complexity only to be pushed out of society and flee to a ruin in the wilds. Once there, he mastered his craft while becoming increasingly brooding and eventually crafting a massive mechanized maze full of automatons, who then went out into the world to plunder resources and take revenge on his enemies. There's some details on the maze itself after this background, which introduces rules that drastically reduce the effectiveness of wizards and spellcasters in general within it. Most of the mechanical minions have innate magic resistance, and a general blanket magic resistance is granted to everything within the maze. There are a few areas which can have their contents varied depending on the needs of the party, especially considering how much the maze impacts the casters of the party, as well as some rather brutal consideration of what happens when a party gets caught in the massive machine works that power the maze. Suffice to say, try not to. There are a few wandering monsters given in a table as is usual, although like the prior offering, wandering monsters aren't necessarily tied to a regular role, but may be sprinkled in whenever the party needs that little bit of extra motivation to keep them going. There's a rumor table and a list of methods to get the players involved, and although they don't go into a lot of depth, the distant nature of the maze of the Mad Master makes them a little bit more important in terms of getting the party started, because otherwise the party may just, wander off instead of actually going in to explore. The player background that follows is a simple intro scenario that the party has meeting the mayor of Sina, which was once the Mad Master's village, and points them towards the maze itself. And then the actual keyed section of the adventure begins. There's an entire section beforehand where the party can try to pick up a few different ways past the outer wall that guards the maze, as you can see, even before they get into that outer wall. And there's several encounters and a couple ways to pick. The maze itself is set up as a sort of circular collection of rooms moving inward, again, towards a center point. And I could have sworn there were some rules to have it rotate, and I thought that was part of it with the cutouts, but I'm not seeing it, so I may have been mistaken in that regard. Anyway, the majority of monsters encountered within the maze are one of two main things. There's various sorts of mechanical constructs that serve the Mad Wizard directly, and then a sort of hybrid gargoyle species called Gretzels that serve him because of past services rendered. The play within the maze itself is also relatively high on trap count. Aside from the random traps covered in the beginning, which can pop up here and there as needed, many rooms contain either intentional death traps or unintentional traps that simply derive from the fact that the party is basically adventuring inside a giant machine. A few of them are the sort of trap that I wish I'd come up with. For instance, there's a brazier with a sign that says, "If you can read this, then your face is being burned off," or something similar. That's pretty classic because the brazier then erupts in fire damage towards whoever's reading it. There is a hall of crushing pistons. There's vats of liquid nitrogen that can go ahead and freeze people, rolling balls, pools to drown people, and more. There's a number of interesting NPCs that can be encountered within the castle, or within the maze rather, and as well as outside the walls in general. There is a local farmer who has honestly never had that much of a problem with the Mad Master, and begins to show a different side of the main villain with his tale. There's a gnomish thief that can be dealt with as the party wishes, but is likely responsible for, shall we say, a little bit of redistribution of some of the wealth within the maze. A few apprentices still seek out their missing wizard master who went within, and there's even a woman who can be rescued, but then who turns out to be a sort of killbot in disguise who doesn't even realize her own nature until she's activated. Once the party gets into the middle of the maze, they can uncover various prisoners who challenged the Mad Master or wronged him in the past, and the unfortunate fates that the mechanisms of the maze have put them to. There is one final twist with the storyline of the Mad Master, although in retrospect, it's pretty obvious. It actually took me off guard when I read it. Suffice to say that the concluding event of the module reveals that the Mad Master isn't exactly himself. And as always, the module closes out with those monsters. A number of them are new, and there are the old ones, which are fleshed out here with new stat blocks, in case you're using a system where they aren't present. So, the other thing about the monsters is that there are a lot of mechanical ones. Clockwork Crow, for instance, is the Mad Master's kind of spokesmouth or spokespiece, and it reminds me of the owl or whatever from Clash of the Titans. But a lot of these monsters are mechanoids and robots, so they may not be suitable for all campaigns if you're going to use it outside of this. So let's take a look at the final module I'll be covering for this review, Maximum Mayhem Dungeons number 7, Dread Swamp of the Banshee. And then I'll go ahead and get into my thoughts on all of them in general afterwards. So Dread Swamp of the Banshee is for yet another lower level range, this time levels 4 to 8. This time it is written by both Alan Chamberlain and Mark Taormino, and it's been designed by another person, Joe Pierce. The script in this one is a little bit flipped, as instead of a dungeon crawl, it is a wilderness crawl through a swamp created by a magical cataclysm that does happen to have a few minor dungeons within it here and there. They start, of course, with a quick credits page in the old school style. Then there's, of course, the GM's background, the general aspects of which are actually relatively brief compared with the other two adventures. There's a history of the swamp itself, details on one of the main antagonists, Astoria Pardition, then a quick rundown of the village of Silt, the local community. A section on navigating the swamp follows, followed by a wandering monster table. The wandering monster table this time is accompanied by a few specific roving threats that can crop up again and again rather than just one-offs. Finally, the intro touches on some of the main antagonists and the curse that follows the main one. There's a brief rumor table before the keyed section of the swamp crawl begins. The Hex Crawl is divided into segments, with each point of interest potentially having its own sub-map and encounters within. So sometimes you'll see something like this, where you've got, this is a bad example because this one actually features the town, but you go in here, for instance, the were-rat, there's a were-rat lair. So you've got a trail and then various rooms within the were-rat lair, and then so on and so forth. There are haunted trees, the were-rat base, of course, a forgotten graveyard, a smuggler's base, and more. There's even a ruined tower that has a portal to a sanctuary on another world. There's also the Pardition Manor, where Astoria herself lives. She serves as both the main motivating force behind the adventure as well as the final antagonist, in that she's secretly suffering from a curse that is slowly turning her into the Banshee that haunts the swamp. The adventure contents conclude with a number of new monsters, this time actually really new monsters for the most part. I mean, there are a couple in here that look relatively familiar but have their own take on it. I actually kind of like the mix of them. So there are also some locations within the crawl, little maps of each kind of minor sub-dungeon that you encounter, which is actually pretty nice. They've got, they're pretty well fleshed out. They're not just like a couple of them are like 5 rooms, but most of them aren't just like 5 rooms and then you're done. A lot of them are actually fairly substantial mini dungeons in and of themselves. One thing to note is that a fair number of the main antagonists, rather than being tied to one area, instead roam around, as I mentioned before. So as one is wandering through the swamp, one can encounter the Banshee or the Soggy Boot Boys or the Blackwater Smugglers pretty much anywhere, even outside their usual areas, at least until you clean those areas out. Due to how relatively small the actual map is, I mean, this is 1 mile, so this is very, very small hexes, not even province level hexes. These are tiny hexes. I think it actually fits with the adventure pretty well to have these creatures being able to wander around as the party explores. So, what do I think about these 3 modules? Well, as usual with Maximum Mayhem Dungeons, the art is on point. I like it. It's very reminiscent of the old school. a little bit better executed in many ways than you may have seen in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but still very spot on, very cohesive, and very evocative of the adventures themselves. So I think that they are pretty much just cleaner versions of what I would have expected in a classic module from, the old school era. They do have just enough humor in them to reinforce the feel of the modules in general, because there is quite a bit of humor sprinkled throughout, and I find them an exceedingly good fit. There are a couple places where the maps are referenced in the text, and either there's a number missing or it references levels of the map by E for elevation rather than L for level. And that's a minor nitpick overall. I got used to it after a while. These kinds of minor things are mostly prevalent in the first few modules, whereas the Dreadstorm of the Banshee seems to have everything covered and is a much more polished product in that regard. There are some greater concerns with the modules in question, starting with the Palace of the Dragon's Princess. And in this one, my main criticism lies with the writing, not the design. The design for this one is fine. In fact, I think it's very good. It presents a very nice take on a classic Save the Princess from the Dragon trope. That's a remarkable amount of adaptability based on the GM's preferences. The encounters are interesting, as I mentioned. I do enjoy the way that they presented the cult leader, and the monsters faced are more varied than I expected from a dragon slaying module. I do appreciate the allowance for different types of character motivations as well. One does not have to go in as a typical Save the Princess hero for this one, as there is plenty of motivation for characters of far less noble goals to go in just for loot or other gain. The writing, however, is another issue. There are a few basic mechanical issues with the writing. For instance, copy-pasted text from a different monster that ended up in the Topiary Garden write-up forgot to change the word treant to Topiary Garden. There are less typos and other technical issues than in previous modules that I've reviewed from this company, at least that I saw, but, there is that. The area box text suffers from the same issues I identified in my other reviews of Maximum Mayhem Dungeons series. That is to say, that there's a very stream of consciousness feel to some of the writing, and it may introduce commentary on what a character's thoughts should be at a situation, which is something that I generally avoid. I like to let my players make their decision as to what their character's thoughts are. I think it's just an issue with the author's style. It's not a bad thing per se, and it can be mitigated by the presence of a good editor, like an actual editor, not just a copy editor, not just a mechanical editor. And it's nothing that a good GM can't fix while paraphrasing the read-aloud text. It's just a little distracting for me, and it was distracting for me when I covered the other ones. It's distracting here. Not going to change it. Sorry, but that's just the way it is. And the problem with this module especially is that little distracting becomes rather really distracting when you're reading through the introductory section. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the introductory material has a few sections that tell of the fall of the castle from different viewpoints, and these sections verge into a short story length. And the same writing style that I found somewhat distracting in the box text is like throughout the entire lengthy story. And I appreciated the added story background given in those introductory stories, but I kind of found them annoying to read. But that is, again, something that can be easily fixed by a halfway decent editor. So, I've noticed that it is actually fixed when dealing with Dreadstorm of the Banshee, which I'll get into in a moment. So it looks like as time went on, that was recognized and dealt with. But I do think that Palace of the Dragon's Princess is a great module overall, which is actually why the writing and editing oversights bugged me. Because it's a great module to play. It's well designed. It just needed a little bit better of execution in terms of the writing, and that's all I have to say on that. So, as I said, this is somewhat alleviated in moving Maze of the Mad Master. In this one, the editing is more on point. The story itself is an interesting read. I have to give credit where credit's due. Finding the few people who'd wronged the Mad Master within the maze and their fates gave me a vague, I have no mouth and I must scream kind of feeling, or something reminiscent of Rocco's Basilisk. This is only reinforced when you get to the end and find out the fate of the original Mad Master. As I mentioned earlier, that particular twist should have been so obvious to me, and yet I actually got caught off guard when I read it. And I think that's a good indication of the writing of the module, because when it takes a very obvious twist and it still catches you, that's actually pretty decent. Now, my main criticism with moving Maze of the Mad Master mostly lies with how it goes out of its way to reduce the effectiveness of spellcasters, and there's even a little bit of overflow into basic rogue abilities in some instances. Just because of the difficulty of the traps, rogues, even though they're really, really good at their job, are at reduced effectiveness in here. Now, I get where the module's coming from, and I understand it in context. I'm just not a big fan of intentionally neutering a class's main utility for extended periods of time, unless it's part of the main setting overall. And in that instance, I can understand it. In this instance, it's the main drive of the adventure. I can also understand it. It's just not something I'd normally do myself. It fits in context, just not my personal way of handling things. Now, the final module, Dread Swamp of the Banshee, I think has to be approached a little bit differently, largely because of the structure. While it has some keyed adventure areas, much as the other two, its main antagonists and foes can wander throughout the swamp area. It actually has a much briefer background to the areas that factor into the story, but I think that overall it's actually almost a better story. Palace of the Dragon's Princess took the classic Save the Princess from the Dragon trope and flipped it a bit so it can go into a different direction. Moving Maze of the Mad Master ended up having a surprisingly sympathetic villain once you started delving into the history, almost like some Batman-style villain, where if things had gone a little bit different or if he'd been a little bit more stable, things could have turned out better. Dread Swamp of the Banshee, on the other hand, is more about the area. The history plays a larger part in the storyline, where the main antagonist's ancestor was responsible for the area's devastation, but her own curse arose not directly from her own actions, aside from finding a particular pendant, but rather simply because of her blood connection. Now, that's not to say Astoria Pardishan was a pleasant person to begin with, but it seems that the bulk of the curse laid upon her isn't actually because of what she did. Rather, it's because of her ancestor. And the fact that she's not initially presented as the main antagonist lends some complexity to the overall story. Some of the other antagonists involved are in factions that are totally unrelated and more there to give this image of a decaying backwoods area that really moves the swamp itself into more of a starring role than the story. And a few encounter connections in the swamp aside, it's also the module I actually have the least criticisms with regarding editing, either technical or otherwise. It's surprisingly well written, even though it is for a lower level and thus has lower overall expectations. And I can't fault it. It's well executed. So with all that having been said, Maximum Mayhem Dungeons are a callback to the over-the-top, zany, high-action dungeon crawling of lore from a time when it was more important to have fun than to be particularly deep, and all three of these modules continue that design and the series' themes overall. And yet, I think they actually do a fairly good job of depth as well. All three modules have a relatively high focus on production value, both on the physical presentation and the classic layout. All three modules have classic themes with just a few twists, enough to make them unique. In terms of encounter design, they are well balanced for the levels involved. I had no problem with any of the monsters presented or anything like that. The treasure flow is a bit spotty at times, but it follows a nice balanced reward structure at the end of the adventure, because a couple of them are really rear-loaded, especially the Palace of the Dragon's Princess, but that's to be understood because you're basically fighting a dragon at the end, and yeah, the treasure is going to be at the end. There is only a couple of what I might call really challenging combats in any of the three modules, although at least for Palace of the Dragon's Princess, that only stays true if the party doesn't go full Leroy Jenkins into some situations. Because you can do that, and you can make things much harder on yourself. Now, if it seems like I was rough in the writing style of the Dragon's Princess, it's not because I thought the module itself was bad. As I said, I think it's very good. I think all three of these are extremely good modules. It just happens to have some flawed execution here or there. Now, my personal favorite is Dread Swamp of the Banshee, followed by Dragon's Princess, and then Mad Master. But all three modules, I think, are on par with or not better than some of the classic modules that I've encountered over the years. I definitely think they're all worth a playthrough if you're into that classic style of module. Just looking through them, I'd estimate none of them would take more than about 4, maybe 5 sessions to run for my usual group, depending on their actions, of course. And honestly, that's a good value for the asking price, at least in my opinion. Looking back at the whole series, I have to say that these releases do keep getting incrementally better the further into the series you go on in terms of the design. So it is a series to keep an eye on going forward if they continue to make them. There's a couple entries that I haven't covered. I may try them at some point, but for now I think I'm going to leave off here. This has been the RPG Crawler with my look at Maximum Mayhem Dungeons, number 5 through 7. As always, I'll drop some link to where you can pick them up below, and I'll drop a link to the site in case you're interested in the box set. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye. And if you are still watching, I would like to take the opportunity to thank my supporters, the top tiers of which are listed on the screen, without whose support I would not have been able to offer the variety of content that I have on this channel throughout the years. If you're feeling particularly generous and would like to join them, you can support the channel. There are a variety of options to do so. I have a Patreon, a Subscribe Star, as well as channel memberships enabled. If you are not in a position to contribute, simply leaving a like, a comment, or sharing my videos are all wonderful ways to help the channel grow without spending a dime, and are all greatly appreciated.